Okay, my name is Roy Newton, and I was with the 9th Air Force, the 98th Bomb Group, the 344th Squadron, based in Benghazi, Libya. And we were newly arrived and had roughly 7 missions when we went to Ploesti. That is 7 missions together as a complete crew. We had had previous missions with other crews as a introductory kind of a thing to the war. We were positioned to fly off of Killer Kane's port side going into Ploesti, and since we were newly arrived at Benghazi, we were absolutely amazed that we were moved up to the front chair to be next to Kane, and it was always a mystery to us how they had selected this kind of an arrangement. We feel that our charismatic pilot had met Kane in some sort of a way, and they became friends, and that Kane had probably selected Hadley to fly alongside of him.
Why was Kane considered such a great pilot?
We always thought he was a great pilot and a good one. We thought he was stern, and we felt confident that if you flew close to him, you stood a good chance of coming home. So we were pretty proud of the position that we were put in.
And why did
we didn't know enough about Kane in the short time that we'd been there.
Why did he get the name Killer Kane?
I believe that it probably came out of the comic strip a long while ago, the Buck Rogers thing, in which there was a killer in it, and his last name was Kane, and somebody just threw it together. But I think it all started in America before he went overseas.
When you were preparing for the Ploesti mission, what do you recall about the actual practice missions and the explanation to the troops that they were going to go on such a mission?
We weren't on each and every flight out over the practice target area. Probably we flew on maybe half of them, and I don't know how many of these were. But mainly I think it was the desire to have the pilots and the navigator and the bombardier get the main experience of finding these targets and maintaining this low altitude and close formation thing. The rest of the crew had really no relationship to that kind of a practice mission.
While you were there for those first few missions and your crew was getting some combat time, what did it feel like to you to get ready for a mission like the Ploesti mission? What was your frame of mind?
Well, the low-level thing didn't bother us at all because in quite a bit of our stateside training, our pilot liked to fly low, and we went through in a training area that was close to his home in Arkansas, Kansas, and he delighted in buzzing, coming down through the low hills and buzzing his hometown to let the folks know that, you know, he'd really achieved all of this great success, and here he is in a 4-engine bomber. And he first started that in early training when he was probably in an AT-6, and as one individual he'd come in on the town at the end of a training flight or something and buzz home, and as time went on he talked some of his other training pilots to go along with him, and we understand at one point that there was as many as maybe 6 or 7 AT-6s that had swooped down on the hometown to buzz it. When we met up with him, why he continued this desire to always keep reminding the hometown folks that he was up there and he had achieved it, and we came in very, very low all the time.
How did you feel about having a pilot that might have been so possibly reckless?
We didn't think that he was reckless. You know, we knew he was a great pilot. We had the absolute confidence in the guy. Whatever he wanted to do, we'd go along with it and laugh all the way, including going under the suspension bridge up in Colorado. He was so proud of doing that. He knew his capabilities, and he never pushed it beyond the point of danger. He'd always back up just a little bit from it. He loved to buzz that airplane, no matter where we were.
What do you recall about being briefed for the mission?
We probably had, as an enlisted man, that I was, maybe 3 or 4 briefings. And the only one that really hit me the hardest was the very last one, when they said that if you guys go there and destroy the target, and if none of you come back, it will be well worth it, because you're going to shorten the war by a considerable amount. And leaving the briefing and being driven back to our camp, everybody was quiet. It finally then hit home that this was going to be a dangerous mission. And of course they said to write a letter home and leave it on your bunk with all your personal belongings before you leave for Ploesti. And I tried to write that night, and I couldn't think of anything to say. And I went through a couple of packages of cigarettes and had paper all over the floor, and I finally didn't even write a letter back home.
What time did you get to bed, and what time were you awakened?
We were awake about 5 o'clock, and I don't think that any of us slept at all that night.
Now, do you recall your takeoff and your flight to the target area? What do you recall that is of significance in that part?
Well, the most significant to me was that when they drove us out to our plane that morning after breakfast, Hadley, our pilot, was already there and pacing up and down alongside the ship. And as we jumped off of the truck, he grabbed the other waist gunner, Hallwagger, who was on the left waist. I was on the right waist. And he grabbed us both by the arms, and he hauled us over and said, "Look it, I want you to listen to me very carefully." He said, for 2 days I've argued against this thing, and I didn't think that these guys would be that stupid, knowing that we're going to go into to a target at 50 feet or whatever, and they wanted to put incendiaries on the ships. And he said, I thought at the last minute that they'd back out of that, but he said there are 4 boxes of British incendiaries, 2 boxes at each waist window. And they had told us about it previously, but we thought they were just joking. But it was going to be our task to throw these things out the window as we went through the target. And Hadley was just absolutely fuming mad. So he said, "Now look, at some point we're going to be going over some mountains. We're going to be in cloud cover." He said, "I don't want to take any of those things into Ploesti." He says, "You throw them out very carefully, one at a time." And they were about, 30 or 36 inches long, in boxes about the size of an egg crate. And he said, "I want you to be sure that the planes are staggered above us, that there's nobody close by. We get in that cloud cover, you get rid of every one of those things." And he said, "Then you call me and tell me when they're all cleared out." I say that because had it not been for getting rid of the incendiary bombs, we had 1 concussion hit underneath the airplane that broke the structural integrity of the plane. And those incendiaries would have been right in that area. The floor was buckled as a result of that pressure hit. And we would have been part of the topography of Romania for sure. So it was the smartest thing that he ever did. So of all of the antics and the fun-loving kind of a guy, he had a very serious side of him.
After you got rid of the incendiaries and you moved toward Ploesti, was there anything else unusual that happened to the initial point?
No, other than we were very low, and at one point we went through some treetops, and we were flying just dead level with Kane, and very close to him, and went through these treetops, and it was coming into the target area. So the bomb bay doors were up, and of course the waist windows were open, and our guns were hanging out the waist windows. We happened to be one of the few ships in that raid that had twin 50s in the waist. And we went through these treetops, and all of a sudden these leaves came into the back end of the ship, kicked up by the props up through the bomb bay and through the open bomb bay doors. And I called Hadley and I said, this is a hell of a time to be clipping hedges. And of course, got no answer back from him. But then we stayed at about that altitude, and we were probably about 5 or 7 miles out of coming into Ploesti. And all of a sudden, we were simultaneously hit in the nose, killing our bombardier that took the greenhouse off, and injured our navigator, Tabakov. Number 2 engine was shot out, and then that concussion hit that I had mentioned, the explosion that went off underneath, and the plane was just wallowing in the air, was virtually unflyable. And I just can't understand how they could have, the pilot and the co-pilot could have managed to keep that thing in the air. They got the engine feathered, the prop feathered, and we continued on. Kane got hit with a bunch of small stuff, nothing major. I think he lost 1 engine, I believe. I'm not sure if it was then or shortly afterwards. I was curious what was going on, so I leaned out and looked under the wing, and I could see this inferno at Ploesti. And it was just all black ahead, and I thought, my God, this is incredible. And I had the feeling that I wish I hadn't have looked. So we continued on, and Hadley sent one guy down to bring the navigator out, who had a flak injury in his arm, and he couldn't use his arm because it had severed a nerve. And he looked at our bombardier, and apparently the thing went off right in his face. There was just absolutely no way of saving him at all. So they moved the navigator back up onto the flight deck, and we kept boring on, and here's this thing fluttering all over the sky. About that time, they jettisoned all of the bombs that we had, and we're still coming into the target. And that lightened the ship and made it more controllable in the air. Kane had slipped at that point, had slipped behind us or in some manner, and regained control, and then came back up into position to lead the formation. And then Hadley, by then, was able to keep enough control on the plane that we stayed with Kane all the way.
What was going on inside the plane? Did you hear any talk on the intercom at all?
I don't recall any. I think everybody was so stunned by all of this that nobody was talking.
What happened after you brought the bombs and you were progressing along? Did you ever get around to making a turn to start to go back?
Well, we had to get over the chimneys, and we had to pull up over those. And so that was a struggle. It almost felt like the plane was just stalling, trying to get up over it. On 3 engines and with the open nose, the air was rushing in the nose, and they left the bomb bay. Hadley left the bomb bay doors open to exhaust that air. So we had just a rush of air coming all the way through, back through into the waist area.
So did Hadley decide to stay with the group, or what did he do?
Well, he really had no choice. We were in an unflyable ship, and Kane had his own problems. I saw Kane the whole way, and I couldn't understand how anybody on that plane, with the amount of holes in the plane, how anybody could possibly be alive. I just felt everybody in Kane's Hail Columbia must have been dead. But they kept boring on and staying together, and then soon two other planes grouped around us without any injuries. They got through at 100%, had all four engines going. Was Bill Banks was in one of them, and Lebrecq flying the other plane. So they gathered around us, and then we headed away from the target. There were some fighters that made a couple of passes at us. We pulled away and headed toward Turkey, and then the conversation, as I understand it, that they set a course for Cyprus, which was on the other side of Turkey, if we could possibly get over the various high mountains in the Balkans. That was questionable, so we proceeded to throw everything out of the plane that we could that we felt we didn't need to lighten the ship up, including parachutes and everything. Anything that was loose went out. The pair of 45 Brownings out of each waist window we couldn't disconnect. We didn't have any tools aboard, otherwise they would have been thrown out. So there were four, as I had understood it, there were four of us that were headed to Cyprus, and it wasn't until 1993 that I had read that there was a fifth plane. Bob Sternfield had joined the group, so there were five of us headed to Cyprus. We cleared the mountains in the Balkans, and we made another turn to go over the corner of Turkey into the Mediterranean, and as we cleared over and cleared out of Turkey, we lost another engine, lost number 3 engine, and they had to feather it, so we're down to 2. The oil pressure started to fluctuate, and Hadley was mad because he felt we shouldn't have made that dog-legged direction toward Cyprus, that we should have just cut right over the middle of Turkey and saved all that distance. And he had been calling Kane, but Kane's transmitter had been shot out, so he couldn't relay back to Hadley the reason why. We were out over the Mediterranean and off the coast about 25 miles on a direct course to Cyprus, and we started to lose oil pressure in the other 2 engines. And Hadley knew that we couldn't make it, so he made a generally left turn back toward the coast of Turkey. By now it's almost dark. It's somewhere around 7:30 or 8 at night, and there were no lights on the land of Turkey at all. There's nothing you could recognize. You could barely see the shoreline, and there were no breakers, no waves or anything that would lighten up and indicate where the coast was. But apparently Hadley could sense something, could see something up there, and he made another left turn. And as it ended up, we were paralleling the beach. We were at 150 feet, and as it ended up, we were 750 feet offshore. And at 150 feet, both engines froze, number 1 and number 4. Number 4, the turbo started to burn, and I called Hadley to tell him that it was starting to flame. And he never answered back to me, and I guess his decision was, as long as the thing is turning and burning, he doesn't really care. He needed that extra engine. And then suddenly, as I said, both engines froze, and we stalled, and then went nose first and wingtip into the water. And the plane broke up into three pieces. The nose broke off ahead of the leading edge of the wing, and the tail broke off, and there were 6 of us in the tail, prepared to ditch, and that's what we thought we were going to do. There was the pilot and the co-pilot and the engineer were forward. The co-pilot asked the engineer to read off the airspeed just before the stall had occurred, and Hadley says no, he's going to come right into this dashboard if we hit the water. And still assuming that we're going to ditch the plane smoothly. And so Page, the engineer, sat down in back of the armor plate in back of the pilot. And of course our bombardier was still up forward. So when the nose broke off, both Hadley and our co-pilot Rex Lindsay survived that crash and got out of their seats. But then they got all tangled up and drowned when that part of it sank.
What happened to you in the back there?
When that section, the section that the 6 of us were in, was that part of the fuselage that was attached to the wing. And when it broke, it rotated in such a fashion that it threw 2 of us up on top of the wing inside where the radio equipment and the oxygen tanks were. And both of us broke our right leg. The other guys, the tail gunner had gone into a panic situation and refused to lay down on the floor with us. And he was hanging onto the armor plating behind the waist gun positions, standing on the floor just hanging on to these plates. And I was leaning against the bulkhead leading into the bomb bay and looking at him, and he just suddenly disappeared, and I felt he just went right through the bottom of the airplane. But analyzing it later, I think what happened is that he was in that part that broke, and it rotated in an opposite direction of the section that we were in, and it looked like he was on an elevator as he just suddenly disappeared. And he was just shredded from top to bottom with all of the cuts of the torn metal.
How long did this take place?
I have no idea. Probably seconds. I ended up on top of the wing as it began to sink, and a control cable was wrapped around my ankle. It took all my clothes off except the escape kit and one sock that was entrapped by the control cable, and I was hanging upside down with the ship, the wing section sinking, and I couldn't feel anything, and gasoline in the water and the salt water, my vision was practically nothing. And since I felt like my foot was gone, I felt something was trapping it, and I'd had a knife on the escape kit belt thing, and I remembered that, and I reached up and I was just going to cut whatever was there to try and get loose, and somehow I untangled the steel cable, and I came bobbling up to the surface. By then, those that survived were up on the surface, and our navigator, who had had the injury going into Ploesti, he had a Mae West on, and he asked me where the hell I'd been, and I said, well, you know, what's it to you? So I guess I was down under for a little while, and he went over and got an oxygen bottle that was floating that wasn't greasy, and pushed that with his good hand over to me, and that's what I came ashore on. And I rode that thing in. Took about 4 hours. There was virtually no current and no sea movement. It was just flatter than a pancake. So apparently I just drifted around out there. I couldn't see any. I didn't know which way to try and paddle with the other hand.
What happened to the other men?
By the time I reached shore, they were all ashore. I think 3 guys were not injured at all. They had a few cuts and that kind of stuff, and they were on the shore when I came in.
Was anybody trying to help you get in?
The Turks had built a fire, a Turkish, like, Coast Guard, gendarmes or something, and they were afraid to come out to help anybody because of all this debris floating in the water, and particularly the oxygen tanks that they thought might be bombs. They didn't know if the guys at the shore were armed or whether they'd shoot or not. So they're very reluctant to come and help us. A guy fished me out of the water, a Turkish man, pulled me up on shore. By then, this is like at something like 1 o'clock in the morning, and a little bit of surf action was there, and I was just washing back and forth, still hanging onto the oxygen bottle. And he finally dragged me up onto the beach. The beach was very rocky and very uncomfortable. And then later he carried me over by their fire, and I could get a little bit warm. And shortly thereafter, they went down and built a fire for the other guys, for the other 6 guys.
What did they do to you then?
The next morning, they had decided that that they were going to try and move us off the beach. And about 11 o'clock in the morning, we could hear this offshore. About 9 o'clock in the morning, we could hear a motor way offshore, but we couldn't see a boat or anything. And the reasoning was that it was probably a fisherman out trolling for fish. And then it was quiet for a long while, and at 11 o'clock, a British Wellington, about 5 feet off of the rocks on the beach was virtually full of big rocks, and this Wellington came down right on top of us, about 5 feet over, and just hopping over the dunes, and spotted us and made a bunch of passes. And it was the British RAF Air Sea Rescue search plane. Killer Kane had ordered, after he crashed on his landing at Cyprus, he demanded that they get a rescue effort going back to where we turned back toward Turkey. And the Air Sea Rescue boat had 175 miles to go, and they went full tilt all night at about 20 knots to reach us. And that was the motorboat that was offshore, searching the grid about 25 miles offshore, while the Wellington plane flew around in other areas that they could get to. And they decided on one pass down the beach, and fortunately they saw us. So they shot flares, and that scared the hell out of the Turks, and the Turks all started to cock their guns, their rifles, their ancient weapons, and didn't know what was happening when these flares went off. And soon the Air Sea Rescue boat came storming on into our position, dropped an anchor, and lowered a dinghy, and I think 3 or 4 guys initially came in on the dinghy to aid us and give us some medication. Then a guy carried me from the fire early that morning, about 2 miles inland, on his back, fireman style, and laid me underneath a tree, and the rest of the guys that could walk dead. The other guy with a broken leg, he had to be carried. So the 7 of us all ended up underneath this tree. And the British gave us morphine and tried to do as much as they could. I had a compound fracture, so the movement that I had was a pretty painful thing, and there wasn't anything they could do about it anyway. Then they decided they would move us to a larger town where there was a hospital and medical treatment available. And that was by farm roads, zigzagging for, well, by crow flight, it was about 70 miles. I have no idea what the road distance was. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, they decided that they wanted to move us where we get better medical treatment. And they put us on a truck and drove us to a town called Antalya, which was to the west about 70 miles. And we reached there somewhere early in the morning at 1 or 2 o'clock. There was not a doctor there. There was an old nurse. And we were put in the hospital and kept there for about 2 weeks. And then they decided that we needed better help and that they'd move us up to Istanbul on the other side of Turkey. And they took us there by train. Those that were not injured were sent to Ankara, to the prison camp, where they held both American and German prisoners all in one camp. All of the injured ended up at Istanbul, and there it was in an American-sponsored hospital called the American Hospital, and that was where I got a cast put on the leg. We were there about a month and a half to 2 months, and then they took us by train across Turkey to Syria, and then we got to Cairo, Egypt, and from there back to America. And
when you were in America, what happened to you? Did you get out of the service immediately, or what?
well, I still had this this compound fracture, and by then the bones had sort of worked their way up about 3 inches. So I spent the next 2 years in Army hospitals trying to keep them from cutting my leg off. Every hospital that I went to, they said, "Hey, there's nothing we can do. We're going to have to. They've knit, and we're going to have to cut your leg off." And then was a little bit of a rebel, and I'd raise a lot of hell, and they'd pass me on to another hospital. So after a year and a half, I finally ended up in Palm Springs, California, and was going with the head nurse, and raising hell all the time, and 7 shaved tails. Lieutenants came to my bed on inspection one day, and they all collectively agreed that, there's nothing they can do. The foot's going to have to come off. And so I went in and got drunk, and they sent the MPs for me. And she had been trying to also find a good orthopedic surgeon, and she found one in Santa Ana, not very far from here. And on D-Day of 1944, we listened to the landings in Normandy, and this Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hastings, working by himself, did a sliding bone graft on my leg and saved it. And I still have the 7 screws in it. And then after I was rehabilitated, then I was discharged, and then forgot about the war in Ploesti for 50 years. Just put it out of my mind.
In putting it out of your mind, did it resurface at all?
It never did. The only time that I had a daily reminder of it with this gimpy leg. But the reason I put it on my mind, for one thing, I had to build a life of my own, a career and a future and a family and all of this. And that took a lot of concentration to get an education and all. But every time I would talk to someone, and they'd ask me about my experience, and they'd cut me off and they'd tell me a worse story than what I went through. So I said, why even talk about it? I got heavily involved in my work and studies and so forth, and I had no reason to reflect back on it. I wasn't bitter, but through the years I became sort of anti-war, anti-military. It's all a waste, it's all stupid, and I had read quite a bit of war history or politics and so forth, and beginning to realize, this whole thing was just really futile. And that just drove me further away from thinking about Ploesti, but I had no bitterness at all on it. I had no bad memories. I always remembered the good fun things with Hadley and buzzing his hometown and all the times we'd go out and get drunk in town, and I remembered the fun part of it.
Now, after 50 years and you've started to talk about it, do you think the risks that were taken to do the mission were worth the results?
I think it was poorly planned. And I think the mistake made by those other groups that missed their IPs. And I distinctly remember in briefing before the mission that somebody said, if you miss your target, get the hell out of there, because you're going to screw up somebody else's target. And in the back of my mind, I always kept thinking, well, how could these groups come back over our target, which was the biggest one there? And we were all told the same thing. If you screw up and don't get to your target, get away from there.
In your opinion, then the planes should have simply dispersed out of the area rather than go for targets.
That's what the orders were. And especially Ent was on one of them. He was. I'm not saying I hold it against the guy or I blame him, but he was on the one plane that fractured the cardinal rule.
Was there ever any kind of reprimand or derogatory action taken against anybody in the Ploesti raid?
Not that I'm aware of. I didn't read anything about Ploesti because I wasn't interested. And it wasn't until after my wife had passed away in 1989 and I was traveling to try and get to feeling better, and I spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, and trying to always figure out, well, where's the next place I'm going to go to for fun. And then I thought, I really like Turkey. I might as well go over there and look at some of the digs and so forth. And quite by accident, I had heard about the 50th anniversary of the 98th Bomb Group was going to hold their reunion in Tucson. And I thought, well, gee, wouldn't that be a kick to go to? Because I hadn't been in contact with any of the crew members. I didn't know who was still living or not. And I finally found two and decided that I was going to go, and out of their curiosity, they decided to come down and meet me at Tucson. It's the first time we'd met in 50 years. And at that, I saw a photograph that one of them brought along, and it was the seven of us laying underneath this tree in Turkey that was taken by one of the RAF Air Sea Rescue guys. And during the war, he sent this little snapshot to Page's wife in America. And he showed me this, and I couldn't absolutely believe that during World War II, somebody would take a photograph of us laying up there underneath this tree. And that it just started to intrigue me, and I thought, damn it, I'm going to go find that airplane. I think I could almost walk right to it. I think if I could identify the area, that I would be able to recognize a lot of the land features. I had that much confidence. It wasn't true as it ended up, but then I also met the navigator for Killer Kane, Norman Whalen, and I asked him what our route was to Cyprus. And he, through all these years, he had kept his navigator's log, and he showed it to me. And he showed me all of the coordinates and the course line. So I went home and got a bunch of maps out, and like a little kid, and I said, hey, now I know about where I think we turned from the formation going to Cyprus, and I think I could zero in on that thing if I went to Turkey. So I booked myself a vacation to Turkey and started walking the beaches. And as it finally ended up, I was within 20 miles on a coast that was 600 miles long. Wasn't a bad try. But while I was there, a Turkish newspaper had heard about this crazy American walking the beaches looking for an airplane, and they wanted to do an interview, which I agreed to. And a couple of days later, I flew back to America. And about 3 weeks later, I got a letter from Turkey. And it was a man in another part of Turkey. And I thought, oh God, my credit card's loose somewhere. And it's a bill, I thought it had a letterhead of a hotel. And I thought, God, somebody's going to nick me. That they got my credit card number, and it was a bill. And I opened it up, it was a personal letter. And it was a Turkish man who had found the plane in 1972 while filming sea turtles coming ashore. And he was out offshore, and all of a sudden, whammo, here's this B-24 stuck on the side of the shelf of the seabed. And he wrote me a letter, and then we started to communicate. I had previously tried to get location information out of the RAF, but nobody had even given me the time of day, so I'd given up on that. But this Turkish man would not tell me where it was, naturally. You know, it was his property by squatter's rights, and he didn't want me taking off on my own. So we communicated and decided that in the fall of 1994 that I would go over there, and he intended to take the airplane out of the water. And I went over and met him for the first time. Fell in love with his family, he and his wife and 3 sons. He had taught his 3 sons how to scuba dive on the harem, which is what we call the airplane, Hadley's harem. And the kids grew up learning to scuba dive on this airplane. And in 1978, he brought part of the right wingtip out of the water. His purpose was to scrap it for the aluminum value, which was very dear, still is in Turkey. It's very valuable. And so we were harassed by the Turkish government in trying to get permits to remove the plane. Finally, the weather turned bad. We had to drop everything we were doing, and I came on home, and he had then intended to resume it in the summer of '95. I stayed packed all this time to be on call to go back in case the weather did clear up. The feature was that there was a huge river that flowed over the harem that stirred up all of the mud, and 1 hour it would be gin clear, and the next you couldn't even see your own hand in front of your face. So that hampered the operation, as well as the Turkish government officials. So finally, in the summer of 1995, by then somebody had suggested that I take somebody along, a historian who knew the B-24 North Africa, would like to come along and live the same adventure and see the thing come out of the water. We still truly believe that it would come out. I believe the Turkish man. So on the second trip, Peter Frizzell and I traveled together. And we went over there, and same harassment, permit problems, the same loss of money. It's no different in Mexico. Turkey's the same in Mexico and America and everywhere else. Everybody's got their hand out. But finally, the nose of the airplane was brought out. We were originally scheduled to be there for 3 weeks, and he had intended to bring the entire airplane out. And we kept upping our return flight schedules until originally it was supposed to be 3 weeks, and we got up to, I think, about 5 weeks. And I had gotten food poisoning, and I was really sick. And I climbed on a bus and went back to the same town that I was taken to 50 years before, Antalya, where I'd be close to a hospital. And I left a note for Pete. I didn't want to upset any of the operation that would delay it from going on forward. So I slipped out on my own, caught a bus, and hightailed it out of there and left a note for Pete. And he called me at the hotel and he says, "Look at Roy," he says, "we're a tag team. You got us up to here." He says, "Let me take it from here on out." So I never saw the nose of the ship come out, but Pete did, and filmed it.
What do you remember about the whole event there that stands out in your mind of being back in Turkey and being a part of that operation?
Well, it probably seems like a little crazy for, pretty late in life for somebody to go back and look for their airplane. I love Turkey. The weather is, and terrain is almost spot on like Southern California. I like the people. Most of the people are very friendly. I just thought it'd be a nice adventure. And I had intended originally to try and locate it. I had hired another diver previously to go under if he found it, and to get 4 black and white photographs of it to prove that it was the harem. Then I was going to come home and I was going to write like a 10-page letter correcting history, because of all of the 15 or 20 books that were written on Ploesti, nobody tells the truth. And that's what really made me more determined to go back and try and find it and locate it. Everybody said we were everywhere else that we shouldn't have been. Some wrote that we were taken from Turkey to Cyprus, and that wasn't the truth. I was mad at all of these authors who were writing things that they just had no understanding of what they were doing. So I was just going to correct history in a small sort of a way. I never envisioned that we would ever get to a point of actually salvaging the ship and bringing the pilot and the co-pilot's remains back. You always hope for this kind of thing, but I never gave it a snowball's chance in hell that it would ever happen. But it did. And for that, that is the icing on the cake.
Where were the pilot and co-pilot buried?
One of them in Gilmer, Texas, the co-pilot, Rex Lindsay, and our pilot, Gil Hadley, was in Texarkana, Kansas, within 2 days of one another this last January.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about the mission or about the recovery that you feel is important to be on this tape?
I really can't think of a thing.
What do you want the world and history to remember about your contribution to the war effort?
That's a trick question, too. Well, when you're 19 years old, you don't go into this thing with the fact that you're going to save the world as an individual. You do what everybody else is doing by the thousands, and I can't say that I'm proud of what I did as far as the war itself goes. I think that I can say that I'm very content for the recovery effort of the pilot and the co-pilot. That to me is the highlight of the entire 53 years. I feel like I've really done something for a guy I just thought the world of, Hadley. And the reception that we got from his family of having his returns brought home, it was just like a whole new world, a whole new friendship. They were so happy after all these years to have Gil Hadley home. And that really gets pretty deep inside of you.